The midday sun in Dust River always arrived earlier than anywhere else. It settled over the low wooden roofs, slipped through the station's corridor, and hung in the air as drifting layers of pale dust. When the eastbound train released its final tired breath and rolled away, the platform was left with only the slow, familiar sounds of a town long accustomed to its own quiet. In that heat, Zadie Laurent stood with an old valise in her hand, her breathing still unsteady after days of travel. The metallic smell of the train had not yet faded when the dry dust of the platform settled across her shoulders. She glanced around, hoping for a familiar face or at least someone waiting for her, but all she saw were scattered figures hurrying back to their own work. No one had come. The absence of a familiar step tightened something in her chest. She told herself someone must have been delayed, or the letter announcing her arrival had not reached in time. Even so, the feeling of being left behind, even for a moment, sent a faint tremor across her shoulders. Zadie drew a steadying breath, but before she could settle, a strange voice rose behind her, rough, drawn out, as if the speaker had been waiting all morning for the chance to say a single line. "Well now, look who we've got here." She turned. Two men stepped out from the shade beside the old freight shed, their lazy strides and curious, unwelcome eyes making their intentions plain. One was tall and thin, hair slicked flat with sweat. The other was shorter, but carried himself like someone used to looking for trouble. "A stranger, huh?" the tall one said. "All alone, in this heat." Zadie pressed her lips together, tightening her grip on the valise. She had no wish to cause trouble, and even less desire to draw attention in a town she didn't know, so she simply nodded in place of answering. "We could take you where you need to go," the shorter man murmured, stepping half a pace closer, his tone too soft to be harmless. Zadie instinctively drew back, her spine brushing the wooden column of the platform. Words of refusal rose but caught in her throat when she saw something shift in their eyes. She scanned the platform. Empty, the sunlight stretching their shadows longer by the second. When the shorter man lifted his hand toward her sleeve, a calm, steady voice cut cleanly through the heat. "She's not going with you." The words were not loud, but they held enough weight to stop every movement for a heartbeat. Zadie turned toward the sound and saw him. A man standing in full sun, yet carrying himself in a way that made others step back without thinking. Boon Mercer. She didn't know his name yet, but the broad frame beneath the brim of his hat, the gray eyes cutting through the glare, and the steady posture, as if even the platform itself relied on him to stay upright, made her forget the fear of a moment ago. Boone walked forward without haste. No hand on a gun, no raised voice. He simply repeated himself, as though they were discussing an ordinary matter. "I'm here to fetch her." The shorter man frowned. "And who are you supposed to be?" "The Wells family asked me to come in their place," Boone answered, his eyes never leaving Zadie. There was something in that gaze, not curiosity, not pity, only the certainty of someone used to standing in the wind and never forgetting the person beside him. The tall man sneered, ready to argue, but when Boone took half a step closer, the silence grew so sharp that the faint creak of the station eaves could be heard. At last, both men gave a dry, forced laugh and walked off, leaving a trail of dust behind them. Zadie exhaled, slow, long, as if she had held her breath from the moment the train stopped until now. Boone bent to pick up her valise. When his hand brushed the back of hers, just a fleeting touch, a thin but unmistakable warmth ran along Zadie's wrist. She lifted her gaze and met his gray eyes. No rush, no pressure, only a steady patience, waiting for her to find her balance again. "You all right?" Boone asked, his low voice carrying just enough warmth to reach the deepest part of her chest. Zadie nodded, a small, slightly trembling nod. Boone tipped his head toward the far end of the platform. "Come on, the Wells family's waiting. Too hot to stand out here." He walked ahead by a step, and Zadie followed. Not because she needed someone to show her the way, but because in the slant of sunlight across his shoulders, she sensed this was a man placed in her path at the exact moment she needed him most. And for the first time in months, she did not feel alone. The wagon wheels rolled over the red dust road, turning in slow circles under the sun. Boone walked a short distance before stepping onto the side rail and offering his hand to Zadie, the gesture so natural it seemed he had done it all his life. Zadie placed her hand in his, hesitant at first, but the steady strength of Boone's palm steadied her within a single breath. The wagon moved slowly through Dust River. The town was smaller than Zadie had imagined. A few wooden storefronts, a general store with half-finished paint on its sign, a blacksmith shop echoing with the steady strike of a hammer, and a stretch of low buildings running toward the dirt road that opened onto the plains. To her eyes, everything felt unfamiliar in a way that made her shrink into the sleeves of the dress she held close. Boone glanced over, just enough to notice. "First time out west?" he asked. "Yes," Zadie replied, her voice so soft it nearly dissolved into the sound of hoofbeats. She looked down at her dark plum dress, the high collar and row of tiny buttons straight and precise, a style suited to parlor teas in Eastern sitting rooms. Here, under the sun and dust, it felt as though the dress itself declared to the town that she did not belong. Boone said nothing more, but when he saw her lift a hand to shield her face from the sun, he quietly pulled a light brown scarf from behind him and placed it in her hands. "Cover your head. The sun here tires folks out quick," he said, the words as plain as advice from someone long accustomed to hard country. Zadie took the scarf and nodded. His tone carried no hint of pity, only the calm steadiness of a man who took care of things without needing a reason. As the wagon rolled into the outskirts of Dust River, a wide wooden house with a long porch appeared behind a line of trees. Boone slowed the horses and turned toward her. "The Wells place. They've been looking forward to you." Zadie tightened her hold on the valise, drawing a steady breath before stepping down. But Martha Wells had already appeared on the porch, arms opened wide as though she had known Zadie for a year rather than through a handful of letters. "Oh, let me look at you. You must be worn out. Come in, around here." "Strangers don't stay strangers long," Martha said, pulling Zadie into a warm embrace that brought an involuntary, gentle smile to her face. Boone stood behind them, removing his hat with a polite bow. His eyes passed over Zadie for a brief moment. Not long, but long enough for Martha Wells to notice. She shifted her gaze from Boone to Zadie, the corner of her mouth lifting in the sly smile of a woman who had lived long enough to recognize a man's look when his heart tilts toward someone. Zadie flushed, unsure why. Supper was simple but warm. Cornbread, stew, and garden vegetables. Ordinary dishes, yet so comforting that Zadie slowed her eating just to feel the hunger unwind after her long journey. Boone sat across from her, quiet, but never detached from the conversation. Each time Martha asked about the trip or Zadie's health, he angled his head to listen, his eyes settling on Zadie's face longer than necessary. Zadie felt it, not through her eyes, but through the way her heart reacted each time Boone looked her way. After supper, Zadie helped Martha clear the table. Boone, like most Western men, started to rise out of habit, but hesitated, unsure if he'd be intruding. Under Martha's pointed look, he stepped forward to gather the dishes. Zadie turned, holding the last plate. Boone reached for it at the same moment. Their fingers touched. Not hard, not intentional, just a brief contact. But to Zadie, it was soft enough to shift her heartbeat. And in Boone she caught something fleeting, a rare flicker of uncertainty on the face of a man who usually stood unmoved in wind or dust storms. They looked at each other. Only a second. Yet it felt longer than the whole Dust River afternoon. Boone drew a breath and took the plate. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice steady but a shade deeper. By the time Boone left the Wells home, the sky had settled into violet dusk. Zadie stood on the porch, watching the shape of him on horseback. Broad shoulders, straight back, his shadow stretching long in the fading light. For the first time in many months, something loosened inside her. Not a grand hope. Just a small, warm stillness. Enough for her to know Dust River might be more than a place to begin again. It might be where her heart learned how to find its way back to itself. The first days in Dust River passed slowly, but not with the heaviness Zadie had feared. The Wells home was small but warm, with a rhythm as steady as the hammering from the blacksmith's shop at the edge of town. Each morning Martha rose early to make cornbread. Zadie followed, awkward at first, but quickly falling into step, finding comfort in the simple routines. She taught the local children the alphabet, how to write their names, and a few basic numbers. The bright eyes lifted toward her with eager curiosity, softened her heart in ways she hadn't expected. The chores in the backyard, picking vegetables, shaking out laundry, preparing firewood, made her feel useful, rather than a shadow of a promise that had faded back east. She didn't yet realize that within the rhythm of her days, a man was also slowly stepping into her life. Quiet, steady, almost unnoticed at first. Boone Mercer appeared every day, but never for the same reason. One day he brought a bundle of firewood, heard the Wells place was running low. Another day he arrived with a basket of apples, saying, "The trees are full this year." Some days he came to the backyard just to return a hammer with the explanation, "Borrowed this last week." Other times he stood under the porch, holding a sheet of town news, read a line or two, tipped his hat, and left. To anyone else it was ordinary. To Zadie, each of those small coincidences filled the hours between them with a quiet weight. She didn't ask why he kept coming. Boone never explained. But whenever he stepped into the yard, the Wells home seemed wider, brighter. One morning Zadie was washing clothes beside the water basin. The sun was still soft, the wind moving gently across the drying lines. She had rolled her sleeves high, her hands wet, her hair twisted neatly at the back of her neck. The rustle of fabric in the wash basin mixed with the birds' early calls. Boone stood a few steps away. She didn't know how long he had been there. He leaned a shoulder against the porch post, watching the small movements of her hands. Silent, still, without a single unnecessary sound. Only the quiet presence of someone who knew how to stand still. Zadie looked up just as Boone was watching her. Their eyes met. Not for long, but long enough for her to glance away quickly, her ears warming as though touched by sunlight. "Have you been here long?" she asked, trying to sound steady. "Since you rinsed the second shirt," Boone said, his low voice free of hesitation. She let out a small laugh. He held out a basket. "Fresh apples. Thought the house could use them." "Thank you," Zadie said, and when she took the basket, their hands brushed, brief, unnoticed by anyone else, but enough to send her heartbeat off balance. That afternoon, while Zadie hung the laundry, she climbed onto a small stool to pin a bedsheet to the highest line. A sudden gust of wind snapped the large sheet against her, making her lose her footing. She slipped, letting out a startled cry. Boone moved as though he had been waiting for exactly that moment. He reached her before she fell, his hands closing around her waist, holding her upright. His grip was gentle but firm. The distance between them was so close Zadie could hear Boone's breathing. Steady, warm, and near. She looked up. Boone looked down. His gray eyes held something beyond simple concern, a sharper attention, as though every time he stood near her, he had to steady himself against it. "Easy now," he murmured, his voice softer than usual. I'm fine," Zadie said, though her heart pounded hard enough she feared he could hear it. They stepped back from each other, both slightly flustered. Boone cleared his throat and adjusted his hat, while Zadie smoothed her apron as though looking for a place to hide. From the kitchen window, Martha Wells witnessed the moment. She smiled, the kind of smile a woman gives when spring arrives a few days early. When night fell, Zadie sat alone by the window of her small room. Outside, the town's lanterns glimmered like quiet, watchful eyes following someone's unfolding story. She folded her sleeve and touched the place where Boone had steadied her that afternoon. A small, honest smile formed on her lips. "Dust River, what are you doing to me?" she whispered, unsure if she was asking God or her own heart. All she knew was that after many months closed tight, tonight, in the soft glow of the oil lamp, something within her opened. Just a narrow space, but wide enough for wind to enter and wide enough for one man to step through. One morning at the end of June, when the mist still clung to the birch branches like a thin shawl, Boone appeared on the Wells porch with a hesitation that was unlike him. His gray eyes rested on Zadie longer than a single beat, as if he were searching for the right words, but couldn't find a place to begin. "Zadie," he said quietly, his voice low, carrying a rare hint of uncertainty. If you'd like, I could take you out to see a few places outside town today." She understood him at once. Not a few places. The invitation was clear. He wanted to take her to the Mercer ranch. Zadie felt her heart tighten in a strange mix of nerves and a soft, unnamed tenderness. She nodded, hiding her fluster behind a gentle smile. "Let me get my shawl." All morning she prepared more carefully than necessary. She chose a light blue cotton dress, pinned her hair with more care than usual, and when she stood before the mirror, she couldn't help noticing the slight tremble in her hands. When Boone returned, he stood beside his best wagon, the one with polished tack, new wheels, and two tall bay horses shifting eagerly in their harness. He said nothing about how much care he'd put into preparing, but she knew. And that knowing warmed something deep in her chest. "Ready?" Boone asked, his voice rougher than usual. Zadie nodded, and when he offered his hand to lift her into the wagon, the warmth of his palm made her draw a steady breath. The road to Mercer Ranch stretched across gentle slopes dotted with dry grass. The midday sun fell across the land, but it wasn't harsh, almost as if the weather itself was offering them a quiet hour. Zadie looked around with open curiosity. Wide fields, distant hills shaded in faint purple. The smell of dry grass, hot wind, and sun-warmed leather. Everything was unfamiliar, yet none of it frightened her the way she expected. Boone spoke now and then, pointing to a wooden bridge he'd built himself, the riverbank where the horses liked to come for water. His voice was still low and plain, but somehow softer when he spoke to her, as if each word had been measured before he let it go. When the wagon reached the edge of Mercer Ranch, Zadie drew a breath. The sight before her made her chest go still. A wide stretch of land, quiet as a vast amber blanket. Solid horse barns, a high wooden gate, long white fences running down the slope. A herd of strong horses moving slowly toward the pasture, their manes lifting in the wind. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Boone glanced at her, the corner of his mouth lifting, a small smile rare in Dust River. "It is," he said, "if someone knows how to look." Zadie didn't ask who he meant. She only felt warmth spreading from her chest to her hands, where she held the edge of her shawl. He helped her down, leading her along the white fencing to the largest cottonwood on the ranch. Its thick green leaves cast a perfect circle of shade. Beneath it stood a wooden bench, rough but clean and sturdy. "My father was a blacksmith," Boone said after a long quiet. "He taught me to shoe horses, fix wagons, and build something that'd stand even when the wind rises." Zadie tilted her head, listening. He rarely spoke about himself. "He passed early," Boone continued, his eyes on the horizon. "My mother was sick for years. When she died, I left Mississippi with a few things and whatever was left of family. I wanted a place that didn't remind me of loss." "Did you find it?" Zadie asked softly. Boone looked at her, longer than he needed to. "Not until recently," he said. The words dried her throat. She didn't need an explanation. She understood. And the understanding made her fingers gather a fold of her dress to steady herself. She told him in a low, halting voice about being abandoned in Charleston. She didn't share every detail, but enough for Boone to feel the wound she carried. "Back there, people looked at me like I was something wrong," she said. "Here," Boone answered slowly, "no one is wrong just because they've been hurt." Zadie didn't respond. She only looked at him. And in that moment, even the wind seemed to stop and listen. Boone reached into the small leather bag he'd brought and took out a narrow strip of soft, finely cut leather. "I made this from the best piece I had left," he said. "If you'd like, you could use it for your hair." Zadie touched it. Soft, warm, carrying the scent of earth, of horses, of Boone himself, a gift worth no money, but full of heart. "Thank you," she said quietly, afraid to disturb what was taking shape between them. The Dust River sunset drifted in slowly, tinting the sky a muted blue-violet. The two of them stood side by side on the hill overlooking Mercer Ranch, silent but never distant. Zadie felt as if she were standing inside a moment that she would one day return to simply by closing her eyes. Boone stood to her right, close enough that his fingers could brush her sleeve if he wished. But he didn't. And because of that, the moment was even more beautiful. A late afternoon without a confession, yet holding a change so clear it lived in his eyes, in her breathing, and in the way the new leather tie fluttered gently in Zadie's hair. The quiet days at Mercer Ranch did not last as long as Zadie hoped. At the end of July, the wind shifted, carrying the dry, uneasy smell of parched earth. The birds that usually perched on the fences went silent, as if the whole valley were waiting for something ill-omened. That afternoon, while Boone was watering the horses, he was the first to notice. Bramble, his finest stallion, snorted weakly and struggled to stay steady on his legs. Zadie happened to be in the yard when Boone knelt to check the animal. Within seconds, she saw his whole body tense, like a rope pulled too tight. "He's fevered," Boone murmured, mostly to himself. He placed his broad hand along Bramble's neck, his brow tightening. "Not now. Not this time. Zadie stepped closer, worry rising in her chest. Is there anything I can do? Boone shook his head, though his eyes were already heavy with strain. I'll manage. Thank you. But Zadie knew him well enough by now to understand. This was the moment when he needed someone beside him. 2 days later, everything fell apart faster than the Dust River folk liked to whisper about during dry seasons. Bramble coughed until his voice rasped, then refused to eat. 2 other horses began trembling where they stood, their breathing thick as if weighted with stone. Boone barely slept, his eyes hollow, his hair rumpled as though he'd walked through a storm. He boiled pots of herbal remedies learned from the local tribes: wild mint, crushed ginger root, dried bitter grass. His hands stayed stained with red earth and soot all day. Each time Zadie visited the ranch, she saw Boone holding himself upright by will alone. You need to rest, she told him, firm but gentle. Boone shook his head. Not while they're breathing like this. Zadie didn't wait for permission. She rolled up her sleeves and worked beside him. She walked stall to stall, wiping the sweat from each horse's neck, pouring fresh water, checking their temperature by pressing her wrist along their ribs the way Boone showed her. By dusk, they were both drenched in sweat and covered in hay dust like 2 people who had fought through a full day's battle without a single gunshot. As they bent together to check Bramble's breathing, their hands brushed. A light touch, fleeting as wind, but enough to make them both stop. She lifted her face. Boone looked at her. There were no words, only his eyes, dulled by exhaustion, but lit by something deeper, heavier. Zadie pulled her hand back slowly, as if afraid to break the moment. Boone turned away, drawing a long, uneven breath, like someone struggling to quiet a truth he shouldn't show. Bad news spread quickly. The neighboring Tucker Ranch had 2 sick horses as well. Boone heard the news just as the sun slipped into a thin red line over the hills. He stood still for a long time, his hand tightening around the reins until his knuckles whitened. It's a fever, he said, voice rough. It could move through all of Dust River. Zadie watched his broad shoulders sink under the weight. He was the strongest man in the region, but in that moment, he looked as though he held the whole valley in his hands. She didn't ask if he was all right. She only said, I'll come earlier tomorrow. Boone looked at her, ready to argue, and then stopped. He nodded, slow. Thank you. The next mornings, Zadie arrived before the mist lifted. Martha Wells simply pressed a warm cornbread into her hands and said, Go on, child. That man leans on you more than you know. Zadie didn't dare look closely at what that meant. At the ranch, Boone was already awake before dawn. The veins in his arms stood out as he hauled water barrels, checked each horse with eyes worn thin from lack of sleep. When Zadie arrived, he gave a single nod. But in that nod was a quiet relief he couldn't speak aloud. That evening, Bramble worsened. His breathing slid downhill so quickly, Boone stayed beside him from the blue-violet dusk until the night swallowed the last light. Zadie stayed too. No one mentioned going home, and no one spoke of the hour. The only sounds were Bramble's labored breaths, the soft ripple of water in a bucket, and the wind slipping through the cracks of the barn like a whispered prayer. Boone leaned against the wooden wall, his shoulders bowed. Zadie sat beside him, pressing a cool cloth to Bramble's neck. When exhaustion weighed on him, Boone let his forehead drift close to her shoulder. Not fully leaning, just enough. A rare release. Zadie didn't move away. She only tilted her head so her shoulder touched his. an answer without words. Two people, two breaths, two quiet fears, sitting close in the dust river night. No one named the fear. No one asked what came next. Shoulder against shoulder, silent, but warm. And Zadie understood that after this night, nothing between them would ever be the same. A thick veil of dust river fog settled over the land, as if the valley itself were holding its breath. The sick horses lay breathing hard, their sounds tapping against the night like faint knocks on the hearts of the two watching them. Zadie had stayed for 3 days, returning to the Wells Ranch only long enough to wash and change clothes. Each time she came back, Boone looked worse, his eyes sunken, his stance no longer steady. On the 4th night, everything pushed past his limit. They were checking Bramble's breathing together when Boone braced a hand against the stall wall, his breath breaking as though something had been pulled from him. Zadie turned just in time to see him tilt toward the ground, collapsing. "Boone!" Her voice cracked like dry timber. She lunged forward, catching his shoulders before he hit the dirt. The weight of him made her tremble, not from effort, but from fear, sharp enough to sting her eyes. She pressed her hand to his chest, checking for breath. Slow, heavy, but there. "God, why did you let yourself get this bad?" she whispered, almost sobbing. There was no one to call, no time to fetch Martha. Zadie gathered what strength she had and pulled Boone into the small room beside the hay shed, the place he used during long work seasons. The room was dim, lit only by a small oil lamp and a single wooden bed. Zadie lowered Boone onto it, struggling but determined. He didn't stir, his hand cold and heavy. She brewed herbs in a tin pot, the sound of simmering water urging her on. She set warm cloths on his forehead, replacing them as they cooled. At times she brushed her fingers through his hair, an instinct she didn't even notice forming. The night stretched endlessly, like a road with no turning. Zadie sat beside the bed, holding Boone's rough hand between both of hers. Her thumb traced the pulse at his wrist again and again, as if needing to be sure he was still there, still breathing. When the oil lamp thinned to a faint line of light, Boone stirred. His lashes trembled, then lifted. The first thing he saw was Zadie's face, worried, exhausted, holding his hand as though letting go would make the world collapse. "Zadie." Her name on his lips sounded like a man finding water after a long drought. She leaned closer, her grip tightening. "You scared me half to death." Boone tried to sit, but Zadie laid her palm on his chest, gentle, steady, holding him down. "Don't," she said softly. "You don't have to be strong every hour of every day." Boone looked at her a long time, long enough for Zadie to feel her heart miss its rhythm. "I thought," he said slowly, voice hoarse with exhaustion, "if I went down, no one would notice." Zadie shook her head, tears she hadn't felt rising now filling her eyes. "I would. I'm here. Don't say that again." Boone turned his face away, avoiding her gaze, but he couldn't avoid the warmth of her hand on his chest. A faint tremor moved through him, one she felt clearly through her palm. "Zadie," Boone murmured, voice low and painfully honest. "These last days I've been afraid of one thing." "What?" she whispered. "That you'd leave before I could tell you. You matter to me more than anyone ever has." For a few short seconds, Zadie couldn't breathe. It wasn't a confession spoken outright, but it fell heavy and irreversible, like a heartbeat dropping with no way back. She sat at the edge of the bed, bringing her face close enough that only one thought separated them. "I'm afraid too," she whispered. "Afraid of losing you when..." when we haven't even begun?" Silence settled between them. Not the silence of distance, but of two souls carrying their own scars and finally finding a place to rest. Boone lifted his hand and touched her cheek with the rough pad of one calloused finger. A touch so light the slightest breeze could have broken it. But Zadie leaned into it. No more words. Only breath mingling, Zadie's hair falling across Boone's shoulder, the warm herbal scent drifting through the small room, and the quiet thrum of their hearts meeting without being named aloud. The intimacy came softly, like dew settling on grass, slow, warm, colored by two people who had known hurt and were learning how to love again. Zadie pressed her forehead to Boone's, and Boone drew her gently closer. Not hurried, not fierce, just the closeness they had both held back for too long. When the oil lamp sank to its final glow, Zadie lay beside Boone, her head resting against his chest. Boone wrapped an arm around her shoulders, a quiet, unboastful embrace that still said everything, that tonight he wasn't alone. They fell asleep in the last flicker of lamplight, a night that drew a line across their story. After that night, nothing between them could return to what it had been. Dawn came slowly to Dust River, as if the sun itself wished to tread lightly when touching the room where two people slept close after a night filled with fear and gentleness. The first gold light reached the edge of the wooden bed, slid across Zadie's hair, then paused on Boone's broad shoulder. Boone woke first. For a few seconds he didn't know where he was. Only when he felt the soft, small warmth resting against him did everything return. Zadie lay with her head on his chest, her breathing even, her hand still tucked beneath his shoulder, as if she feared he might leave her during the night. Boone swallowed a feeling he hadn't allowed himself in years. He had slept alone for a long time. Too long. So the sensation of someone lying beside him felt strange enough to soften his heart. Zadie stirred, then opened her eyes. The moment she realized she was in Boone's arms, her cheeks warmed. But instead of pulling away, she looked at him for several quiet seconds, as though making sure he truly was all right. "You're awake?" Her voice was soft, a little rough after nights of lost sleep. "Yeah," Boone answered, low and calmer than usual. "I'm still here because of you." Zadie shook her head, lips curving faintly. "Don't say that." A fragile silence settled between them, drawing the room in close. Boone looked at her face in the early light, her deep dark eyes holding something unspoken, her hair loose against the pillow, her worry still lingering like a shadow. "Zadie," he lowered his voice. "I'm sorry I scared you." She dropped her gaze, then spoke with a truth she no longer could keep down. "I thought I'd lost you." As soon as she said it, she turned slightly, embarrassed, afraid he would see everything she'd tried to hide. Boone lifted a hand, his rough fingertips touching her cheek, just enough to make her look at him. "You won't lose me." Zadie parted her lips to speak, but before she could, Boone continued, "I won't leave you alone. Not for anything." It wasn't a binding vow, not a rushed promise. Just a simple sentence, spoken with the full heart of a man who had lived alone too long and who had finally realized he didn't want to return to that solitude. Zadie didn't answer with words. She only placed her hand over Boone's, tightening gently, accepting, responding. Boone sat up first, testing his shoulder and chest. He was still tired, but the heaviness of the night before had eased. He still looked pale, but his eyes carried their usual resolve again. "You should eat something," Zadie said, rising and smoothing her hair. Go ahead. I'll be out in a minute. But when she turned, Boone called softly, Zadie. She stopped. They looked at each other, the shy, tender space between two people who had crossed into something deeper. If you're not ready for whatever this is, he said slowly, I'll go slow. I promise. Zadie felt her heart settle into a quiet, beautiful ache. She stepped closer, touched his arm, and whispered, I'm ready for anything that comes from you. I just need to know you're here. Boone's eyes softened like earth after rain. He didn't speak, only nodded once, deep and steady as a silent vow. Outside, the morning sun lay over the ground like a thin blanket. As they stepped out of the room, the air carried the warm scent of hay, and the horses shifted softly in their stalls. Zadie walked a few steps ahead, Boone following. Then he lengthened his stride, coming to stand beside her. Neither mentioned the night before, but the distance between them was gone. Inside the barn, Boone checked Bramble while Zadie fetched towels and water, as if she had always known the routine. It felt like they were running a ranch together, two people sharing work, worry, and weight on the same side. Boone watched Zadie as she bent to wipe the sweat from Bramble's neck, then stepped beside her, close enough that their shoulders needed only a slight tilt to touch. Zadie glanced up. Boone met her eyes. Nothing was spoken. The bond had already been acknowledged. By this morning, by this glance, by the quiet promise made in a dim room. And when the first sunlight spilled through the barn door, warming them both, Zadie understood. From today forward, neither of them would walk alone. In the days following that remarkable morning, Dust River slowly changed color. The harsh coughing of the horses faded, their breaths cooled, and their eyes began to brighten after nights of relentless fever. Bramble, the first to fall sick, and the one Boone feared for most, finally stood steady again and took a few bites of dry hay on his own. Zadie stood beside him, her hand resting on his neck, feeling the returning warmth of health. Boone watched her, his gray eyes unable to hide their relief. They're going to make it, Zadie whispered, a small smile forming on her lips. Because of you, Boone answered, so simply that it left her flustered. Don't say that, you did. No, Boone cut in, his voice firm but gentle. Without you, I would have dropped before they ever had a chance. Zadie wanted to protest, but the way Boone said it wasn't flattery. It was truth he finally allowed himself to speak. News spread quickly through the area. Ranchers from around Dust River came to thank Boone, shaking his hand, leaving dried meat, coffee, even a few embroidered handkerchiefs. But every time someone praised him, Boone gave the same reply. I only managed because Zadie helped. Zadie stood beside him, lowering her head to hide the light smile on her face, a smile that, whenever Boone saw it, eased him like rain on dry ground. A few days later, once things settled, Zadie returned to teaching the local children. She stood by the wooden board, chalk in hand, reading out letters and numbers. The children repeated after her eagerly, their voices echoing in the small room of the Wells home. Boone stood outside, leaning against the doorframe, watching in silence. No one knew he was there. Even Zadie only realized it when a breeze carried the familiar scent of pine close to her shoulder. She turned and caught his gaze through the doorway. Boone didn't speak. He only smiled. Small, shy, unmistakable. The smile of a man who saw his future in the woman before him. Their eyes held long enough that Zadie rushed the next part of the lesson by a heartbeat. When they began appearing together, walking through town, stopping by the general store, talking to neighbors about the horses. No one seemed surprised. There was something natural in the way they stood near each other, in the way Boone angled slightly toward Zadie as if to block the wind, in the way Zadie looked at him when he spoke with other ranchers. One afternoon, Martha Wells carried a tray of baked bread out to the porch and saw the two stacking firewood side by side. She planted her hands on her hips and grinned. "Hey!" she called. Boone looked up. Zadie did too. "You two finally admitting it?" Both of them froze. Boone cleared his throat and turned away. Zadie flushed so deeply she wanted to hide behind the shed. Martha just shook her head and walked back into the kitchen, still smiling. "I'm old, not blind." Boone looked at Zadie. Zadie looked down. And a moment later, they both laughed. Quiet, real, close. That evening, in the Mercer Ranch kitchen, only the two of them remained. The oil lamp cast warm light across the wooden table, a soft glow that felt held in someone's palm. Boone was putting away dishes while Zadie dried cloths near the stove. Neither spoke. But the silence wasn't heavy. It was easy, gentle, full of something unnamed. When Zadie turned to set the cloth down, Boone was standing there, closer than she expected. "You don't have to do everything," he said softly. "I want to," she answered. The space between them shrank with each breath. And then faintly, a rhythm sounded. Not from any instrument, but from Boone tapping lightly on the table. A soft beat. Then another. He held out his hand. "You feel like dancing?" Zadie looked at that hand. Rough, warm, calloused, yet extended in a way that steadied her heart. She placed her hand in his. They stood very close. Only the crackle of the fire and the slow steps of their feet on the wooden floor filled the room. Boone set his other hand on her back, gentle, as if he feared hurting her. Zadie rested her forehead against his chest, listening to his heartbeat. Strong, steady, safe. No music, but they had each other. No stage, just a warm kitchen and two breaths blending in the quiet. The dance ended with Zadie lifting her face and Boone lowering his. Not quite a kiss, but an acknowledgement they had both known for a long time. A still moment as lovely as a dust river evening touching the night. And when Boone took her hand and led her onto the porch, where the cool wind moved around them, Zadie knew their bond wasn't only born from hardship, it was already moving toward a shared future, steady and gentle. Autumn came to Dust River with yellow leaves drifting across the dusty road, the scent of ripe apples carried on the wind, and the faint twang of strings rising from the town square. Folks hung lanterns, set pumpkins on their porches, and built small stalls selling pies and handmade goods. The fall festival was always crowded, but this year held a quiet kind of anticipation. Boone knew why. Zadie learned soon after, and everyone in Dust River had guessed for months. One late week afternoon, Boone arrived at the Wells home earlier than usual, standing on the porch with a shyness rarely seen in a man so steady. Zadie stepped out, her apron still dusted with flour. "Looking for someone?" she teased. Boone drew a breath, then spoke like a man holding himself steady. "If you want to, we could go to the fall festival together." The words were plain, but within them sat 100 things Boone hadn't yet dared to say. Zadie glanced down at her hands, then back up. "I want to." 2 small words, enough to make the ground beneath Boone widen a little. That afternoon, Martha pulled a dress from the chest she'd saved from last season. Pale gold, sleeves slightly puffed, the stitching firm yet feminine. She adjusted the collar, softened a few loose curls around Zadie's face, then stepped back. "You're a pretty sight," she said. "If Boone doesn't appreciate you, I'll tug his ear myself." Zadie laughed, though a faint tremble hid inside it, the kind that comes when life is about to open to something new. When she stepped onto the porch, Boone went still for a few seconds. He didn't need a compliment, didn't need a sigh. His eyes said everything. "Ready?" "Yes, if you're beside me." Boone held out his hand, and Zadie placed hers in his without the slightest hesitation. The Dust River Festival glowed under lantern light. The air carried the scent of baked apples, roasted corn, and warm herbs. Children darted between ribbons, men drank grain beer, and women stood chatting beneath strings of hanging lights. But when Boone and Zadie stepped into the square, the air shifted half a beat. Everyone looked. Not with judgment, but with the warm curiosity of people who had watched this story take root long before the two of them admitted it. Zadie hesitated. Boone felt it, tightened his hand around hers, then held it openly, firmly. No words, no explanation, just a gesture stronger than anything he had said in his life. Zadie turned toward him. Boone murmured, "So you'll know you're not walking alone." She smiled, soft, bright enough to warm the entire square. Music rose. Fiddle strings, a soft drum, a waltz drifting through the autumn air. Someone called for couples to gather in the center. Boone turned to her, dipping his head slightly like a gentleman he would never claim to be. "Will you dance with me?" Zadie gave her hand. Boone placed his other hand at her back, gentle as if touching a dream. They moved in slow circles. Dust River blurred into a distant backdrop. Laughter, voices, children's footsteps, all faded. Boone watched only Zadie, and Zadie watched only him. In the yellow lantern light, something deep and steady lived in both their eyes, something that said this night wasn't ordinary anymore. An older couple stood watching, hands clasped. "Beautiful, isn't it?" the woman whispered. "Beautiful," her husband replied, "like seeing spring inside autumn." The whole square seemed to release a happy sigh, as though the town had just witnessed something long overdue find its place. When the music quieted, Boone didn't release her hand. Zadie didn't take hers back. He leaned down slightly, his voice low, meant for her alone. "You're the best thing Dust River ever had." The words softened her heart so much she had to turn aside for a breath. When she looked back, Boone was watching her with nothing held back. An expression that said, he chose her, here, now, and for longer than she imagined. That autumn night, beneath lanterns and laughter, their love needed no announcement. The town saw it. The wind carried it. Their hearts kept it. And for the first time in years, Dust River had a beautiful story blooming for all to see. Autumn drifted through Dust River like a long, steady breath. The horses were healthy again. The year's harvest was good, and ranchers passing through the valley said the land looked like it had bloomed anew. Life grew so gentle that at times Zadie forgot the world could still bring unexpected trials. One morning, as she arrived at the Mercer ranch before teaching the Wells children, she saw two strangers standing with Boone in the yard. A young couple and the husband's brother, new arrivals settling near the edges of town. They carried the eager energy of people starting fresh in a new land. Zadie hadn't meant to overhear, but they stood under the cottonwood right along her path. The young man said, "We want to expand our ranch. If you sell us that western strip of your land, we'll pay well. You could move to the new section with us. The soil there is richer. You could start a bigger ranch." Boone didn't answer. Not for a long while. Zadie never heard a reply. Her heart tightened, fast, like a sudden gust pulling the ground out from under her. Move away, leave Dust River, start over somewhere else? He had never mentioned it, not once. She stepped into the yard. Boone looked at her, and that single look made it worse. He seemed conflicted, not decided, not resolved, but unsettled enough that her old wound, the one shaped by being abandoned, stirred awake. For the next few days, a strange quiet settled between them. No harsh words, no coldness, just fewer glances meeting, fewer moments shared. Zadie buried herself in teaching. Boone spent more hours in the stables than work required. Martha Wells watched them both and sighed, as though she'd seen this coming. But she didn't step in. Some things, she knew, had to be called back by the hearts involved. On the third afternoon, the wind picked up, carrying gold dust across the yard. Zadie was putting away lesson boards when she heard familiar hoofbeats. Boone rode his bay right up to the Wells porch. Zadie stepped outside. Boone dismounted and stood before her, not the strong, unshakable man Dust River knew, but a man who looked like he'd walked miles searching for something more essential than breath. "Zadie," he said, just her name. But the strain in his voice said more. She didn't answer. Boone took a step closer, leaving barely half an arm's length between them. "I'm not leaving Dust River," he said, slow and solid, laying each word into the ground. "You misunderstood." "I heard," she swallowed hard. "I heard them talk about you moving and starting a new ranch. I considered selling the land because—" Boone stopped, exhaled. "Because I was thinking about the future. A future where I want you in it." Zadie looked up, eyes widening. Boone went on, his voice soft like the last wind of the season. "I'm not finding new land to run from Dust River. I just wanted something big enough, steady enough, for us, for what's forming between you and me." The air paused. Zadie felt her knees weaken. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" she whispered. "Because I was afraid you weren't ready," Boone admitted. "Afraid I'd push too hard. Afraid you'd think I was rushing. But when you pulled away—" He drew a breath, his gaze unsteady. "I was so scared of losing you, I couldn't breathe." For the first time, Boone Mercer, a man who seemed to fear nothing, said he feared losing her. The words struck the oldest wound in Zadie, the one left from being abandoned, alone in a city that never cared for her. Tears rose, quiet as the first rain after a long drought. "I thought," she whispered, voice breaking, "you'd go and I'd stay behind again, like before." Boone reached out, lifting her chin gently. "No, Zadie. I won't ever leave you standing alone again." She couldn't speak. Tears fell faster. Boone stepped in and pulled her into his arms, holding her the way a man holds something he knows he cannot afford to lose. Zadie pressed her face against his chest, her arms circling his waist. Boone's heartbeat thudded strong and sure, like familiar knocks on old wood. They stayed that way for a long time, in the ranch yard, in the autumn wind, in the glow of a lowering sun. It wasn't the embrace of two people newly in love. It was the embrace of two who had come too far to turn back, and now understood they belonged to each other more deeply than they had realized. When Zadie finally looked up, Boone rested his forehead against hers. "Next time, I'll tell you first," he murmured. "Next time," she whispered back, "I'll ask before I let myself be afraid." And Dust River, as always, fell quiet around them, holding the moment for two hearts finding their way home. Spring arrived in Dust River without noise. It settled into the soil with a warm dampness, drifted into the wind with the faint scent of newborn calves, and bloomed across the white apple branches until standing beneath them felt like standing in a soft rain without a single drop falling. Zadie didn't know the apple blossoms were meant for her tonight. Boone appeared on the well's porch at dusk, when the sky still held a thin violet haze. He didn't explain why he was there. He only stood with a quiet tension Zadie hadn't seen in him since the day they met. "Will you take a walk with me?" The way he asked didn't sound like a simple invitation. There was something deep and steady in his eyes that made Zadie shiver. She nodded and followed him down the path toward the fields. The moon rose just as they arrived. A wide patch of land lay ringed by blooming apple trees, so white the moonlight made the whole place look faintly luminous. In the center, Boone had set a small wooden table, not fancy, a table he had built himself, beside a lantern glowing softly. A leather pouch lay waiting. Zadie froze. Her heartbeat quickened in a way she didn't understand. Boone turned toward her, and the way he exhaled, soft, slightly trembling, told her he had prepared this moment for a long time. "Zadie." His voice was gentle as wet spring earth. She stepped forward. He stepped toward her. A light breeze rustled the trees, sending petals falling around their feet like spring snow. He pulled a small, worn box from the pouch. The edges of the leather rubbed thin. "This was my mother's," he said, voice catching as his fingers opened the lid. "She kept it her whole life. She believed true love was built from kindness and steadfastness, not big promises." Inside lay a faded gold ring with a small stone, not bright, not grand, but beautiful the way treasured things are. Boone lowered himself down, then knelt fully. No display, no nerves, just readiness and sincerity. "You came to Dust River like a wind that woke me," Boone said. "You made the hard days lighter. You made this place a home, not just somewhere to get through." Zadie covered her mouth as tears rose too fast to stop. "I'm not promising perfection," Boone went on. "I'm only promising that each season, each year, each morning, I'll stand beside you. Will you marry me?" Zadie couldn't speak. She could only cry and nod over and over, her whole body trembling with happiness. Boone rose to his feet. His hands shook as he slipped the ring onto her finger. Her hair brushed his cheek, and in that moment, the only thing existing in the orchard was their shared breath. "I have something else," Boone said, still holding her hand. He led her toward a small structure beside the newly repaired stable. Moonlight glowed across fresh-cut pine. "Boone, what is this?" "Open it." Zadie pushed the door. Inside was a wide, clean room with shelves, a chalkboard, and small, unfinished desks. The air smelled of new wood, warm as an embrace. "You said you wanted to teach more children in the area," Boone said behind her, "especially the black children who get overlooked. I thought, if you stay here with me, then the first thing we build should be a place for them to learn." Zadie turned, her hand still on the doorframe. "You did all this for me?" "For us," Boone corrected softly, but firmly. "This is our future." She stepped into him and embraced him with all she had, holding nothing back. Boone wrapped her tighter than he ever had before, as though the gesture itself confirmed neither of them would ever have to build life alone again. Under the spring moon, in an orchard of white blossoms, Boone leaned down and kissed Zadie. A long, slow, warm kiss, carrying every word he had never spoken out loud. And Dust River, for the first time in many years, witnessed a future being laid into the soil by two people who had once known loss, but now chose each other. That morning, Dust River's church glowed as if the sun itself had polished it. Light streamed through the colored glass windows, painting the wooden floor in bands of purple, gold, and green, woven together like silent blessings. The church bell carried softly across town, light as the land's own breath welcoming a new beginning. Zadie walked in wearing the simple white dress Martha Wells had sewn for her. No lace, no ornament, just soft cloth shaped by the love of a woman who had considered her a daughter from the first day. Her hair was tied low, gently waved, with a few strands falling along her neck, making her look like the early Dust River morning touching earth. Boone stood at the altar in the best clothes he owned, clean white shirt, black vest, and the coat he saved only for days that mattered. When Zadie drew close, he looked at her as if she were the one good thing life had ever given him. His gray eyes softened more than they ever had. The town showed up in numbers Boone hadn't expected. Farmers, blacksmiths, shopkeepers, mothers, children, all came, not from curiosity, but from wanting to witness two people who had known loss step into something new. When the pastor spoke the blessing, Dust River fell quiet. Boone took Zadie's hand, his large, warm palm closing over hers as if he could shield her from the whole world. "Do you?" the pastor began. Zadie didn't wait for the full question. She nodded softly, eyes wet, mouth smiling. Boone smiled back, his gaze lowering with a promise deeper than any vow. When they exchanged the ring his mother left behind, the church released a single shared breath, like a big family finally watching two of their own belong to one another. And when Boone leaned down to kiss Zadie, everyone smiled. No applause. No cheers. True happiness had never needed noise. After the wedding, life unfolded quietly but fully, like a wool blanket woven from patient threads. Zadie opened a school in the wooden room Boone had rebuilt for her, a small school but always bright with laughter. The children of color, especially, found a place where they were welcomed with smiles and no fear. She hung a handwritten sign on the door: "Children of every color deserve to learn." Boone expanded the ranch, repaired stables, and planted a new stretch of apple trees along the northern side. Each blooming season, Zadie liked to tease that Dust River had two beautiful things: the white blossoms and Boone in his fresh work shirt at dawn. Then they had children. The first, a boy, with Boone's gray eyes and Zadie's soft curls. The second, a girl with her mother's gentle smile. On autumn evenings, the two ran across the ranch yard, their laughter rising like a reminder from God that what is built with kindness outlasts stone. Time did not hurry. It moved like the seasons, slow, steady, and beautiful. 10 years later, evening settled over Dust River like the lid of a carved wooden box, gentle, golden, deep. The wind slipped through the fields, bending the grass as if bowing to the dying light. Zadie and Boone stood together on the porch. The lines of time made Boone look even steadier, and Zadie even more beautiful in the way of women who have loved and been loved with their whole heart. Their son led a horse toward the stable. Their daughter sat beneath the apple tree, sketching the sunset in soft, clumsy strokes. Everything was peaceful, as if the land itself had agreed to it. Boon wrapped his arm around Zadie and drew her close. "Zadie," he said, his voice low, warm, unchanged in its sincerity. She tilted her head toward him. "If you hadn't stepped off that Dust River train," Boone said softly, "my life would have missed its best part." Zadie leaned lightly against him, her smile faint as the day's last light. "I did step off," she said, "and I met the man God chose for me." Boone held her a little tighter, as if he were holding the whole world in one embrace. The sunset stretched across the field, coloring everything with the gold of a beautiful memory. Dust River rested in their hands, steady, warm, whole, like the story they had lived. A love without noise, just steady, like earth, like wind, like the apple blossoms that never failed to bloom. If this story warmed your heart, please leave a comment, just one line, to let us know there is someone out there who still believes in quiet, steady love like this. And if you'd like to stay with us through more gentle Western stories, we invite you to like, subscribe, and share so we can meet again in the peaceful evenings to come. Thank you for listening till the very end. Wishing you a truly restful night.